Hello, hi everyone. Great to have you on the webinar today. It's finally here. As you may know, we've been talking about BizTalk Migrator for quite a while, and I think it was the beginning of last week. The email came out to say it's finally landed, and so here we are. And today's webinar, we're going to take a first look at the BizTalk Migrator. So we've got an absolutely action-packed webinar today. So hold on to your hats because this is going to be, we've got a lot of ground to cover over the next, well, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And then, yeah, what we want to do is leave plenty of time for Q&A because there's, I'm sure you'll all have questions to answer. So let's start then. Okay, so what we're going to do in today's webinar is we're going to recap a little bit on the story so far, setting a bit of context on the BizTalk Migrator, and then we're just going to take the first look. We're going to literally from an almost blank sheet of paper, we're going to install. We're going to go and install the BizTalk Migrator. We're going to run it. We're going to look at what it produces. We're going to look at the report that it produces. We're going to deploy a converted BizTalk app, and we're going to look at what that produces in Azure, and then all that in about 40 minutes, leaving plenty of time for Q&A. So there's plenty of time for you to ask some questions. The other thing I want to say is that we've got with us today, we've got Dan from Affinus, who's also co-presenting. As if you've been with us for some of our webinars earlier in the year, you will know already that Dan is the world leading expert on logic apps and all things integration on the Microsoft platform. And I just talk a lot about it. So welcome, Dan.
Hi, guys.
And you'll be hearing from Dan in a moment when we get onto the Azure application, especially. So the other thing is this webinar series. We did some webinars in the summer, but we're going to do a few more, taking us from here up till just before Christmas. So every couple of weeks we'll do a little bit more. So today's webinar, first view. But what we're going to do today is just really, quite shallow, but across the whole breadth of what the BizTalk Migrator is. What we're going to do next time is look in a bit more detail at some of the scenarios, and in particular how that actually translates into Azure. We are then going to take a run through the code base and the repos, because BizTalk Migrator is an open source project, and we're going to look a little bit more about what that looks like, what the code is, why it's structured like that. And then the last one, we are putting together the ultimate user guide, everything you need to know in one place about running the BizTalk Migrator. So keep tuned for that. If you've registered on Eventbrite, please register for the next ones. If you otherwise, we will. Everyone that's registered so far, we'll send you the link to the subsequent ones. So I'm sure you'll be enjoying seeing that as well. Okay, so story so far. What can we say? Microsoft first announced the BizTalk Migrator in May at the Integrate 2020 conference. It was billed to be dropping in autumn 2020, which is kind of just where we are. And at that time, we saw a little bit of a few design, a few slides on the design, a few slides on the tool actually running, but not much on what the output looked like. There was a private preview, so at Integrate, people were asked to take part in the private preview, which certainly is something me and Dan have been doing. And so during the summer, we've been participating in the private preview. We've been trying to migrate all sorts of BizTalk apps and giving feedback on that. And then there was launched an announcement last week, 27th of October. So the global CTO architects of Microsoft, put the message out that it's finally here. So that was good to hear. And also on the Logic Apps Live last week, there was a little segment again with a demo. So we are going to do a very, very similar demo to the one Logic Apps Live that went out last week, but we are going to cover probably more detail than that. So because that was really just a whirlwind tour, but we're going to do a little bit, we're going to do significantly more depth on that, particularly when we're talking about the actual output and how that works in Azure. So in a nutshell then, BizTalk Migrator, it converts two Azure integration services or logic apps. It's a command line tool. It runs against exported BizTalk MSIs. So these are the ones that you've, not MSIs that you've created through by putting the package together, but ones that you've actually exported from the BizTalk admin console. And officially, BizTalk 2013 R2 and above is supported. Unofficially, probably other previous versions. Although if you're exporting against a previous version, you need to look at your support because you shouldn't really be running those. And it's open source via GitHub and installed via Chocolatey. So I don't know if you know Chocolatey, but that's where we're going to start next. And this slide here is just really gives you a flavor of how the tool actually works. So if we look at Discover, the first thing the tool does is it discovers, it uses, given those BizTalk MSIs, it discovers what pieces you've got in an application. It then parses them. So in other words, it unpacks your, it puts, you can pull out the orchestrations, you pull out the ODXML, you can pull out the pipelines, you can pull out schemas, the XSDs, you can pull out the maps. Those are all embedded in a BizTalk MSI, so we can get to all of those things. Analyze is where we actually take all those and actually build up a model of the of what the application might look like in Azure. The report renders that information, and then convert is where we actually generate the artifacts that you can deploy into Azure. And the verify is really just where you can deploy that and actually deploy that into your own Azure subscription. So without further ado, let's move on to a demo. So let me just share my other workstation. So there we go. So we'll start off with Chocolatey. So I don't know if you know much about Chocolatey, but Chocolatey is a package manager for Windows, and other package managers are available. Certainly if you program in JavaScript, there's npm Node Package Manager. If you're on Linux, there's things like Debian. So it's a really handy way of installing packages from a command line, and it underneath the bonnet it works on NuGet. So if you haven't got Chocolatey, then you just go to chocolatey.org, you hit the install now button, and you actually don't need to do step 1 of subscribing to the newsletter. But if you go to step 2, really you need an administrator version of PowerShell. You copy this line here, paste into PowerShell, run it, and you've got Chocolatey. So it's as simple as that. And then what we have next is we go to the BizTalk Migrator page. So I think we're going to paste this in the chat, but chocolatey.org/packages/BizTalk Migrator. And again, there's a couple of things on this that are showing as red. And that's because this tool currently is going through the verification process. So it isn't quite a fully live release yet. So when you install it, so you get this install script here. So choco install BizTalk Migrator. Now that's got a -- pre, which just means at the moment this is just in a pre-release. So it's very much a beta. Very soon I think this is going to go live. But if you just copy that and paste it again into an administrator command shell, it's as simple as that to install BizTalk Migrator. So I'll just let that download for a moment. So what you'll see here, we've downloaded BizTalk Migrator. What that will do next is it will probably identify the dependencies, because a package can have dependencies, and it will then so it should then go and get those. There we go. So next thing is the BizTalk Migrator CLI, and this other one, which is BizTalk Migrator Azure, which are the Azure components. And I'm just going to, so we don't have to just say yes to everything, I'm just going to do an A there to accept everything. And there we go. We've installed BizTalk Migrator. So one of the things I can do just to check is I can go choco find and look for what packages I've got locally. And there we go. I've got three packages installed via Chocolatey there that are BizTalk Migrator Azure, BizTalk Migrator CLI. So that's it. We're all good. So what we can do next is I'm going to talk. What we're going to do next is I'm actually going to run the BizTalk Migrator, and what we have is some. If you actually go to the GitHub project, I think we're going to share the link for the GitHub project as well. The BizTalk Migrator ships with some scenarios, and those are FTP pass through. There's a HTTP JSON orchestration. There's a simple orchestration, which is an FTP in, FTP out, and then there's a file receive with XML, including maps. So we've covered some of the sort of core, BizTalk scenarios there, certainly in terms of demonstration. So, but what we're going to do today is to just focus on this first one, the most simple one, which is an FTP pass through. Now in BizTalk, this is an FTP receive location in a receive port that then just does sends to the message box, a send port subscribes to that, sends the message out again. So I've got a command already ready to paste in to do this migration. And let me just go back. This output folder is where it's all going to appear. So, but let me just break this command down a little bit first. So the first thing we do is that we start off with the command aim. Now the BizTalk Migrator, when you run it, the command is actually aim because it's aim.exe is the executable. So, and that stands for Azure Integration Migration. Migrate is the next command. So we have a number of options we can do. We can just generate the report, or we can just do a conversion, or migrate just does the whole thing. And then we've got some options in here. So the first argument I'm passing is where the MSI file is, which is that FTP pass-through one. We can also specify directory that we're unpacking to, because obviously we need to unpack the MSI, so we can specify that directory. I can also set the working directory so that everything goes in my temp output folder. Save state means that we can actually capture the state and look at it later, as in the working state of the tool. And that folder again is where we save the state to. And I can set the primary region so that when we generate scripts, we default to generate to deploy to the primary region. And I can also set secondary regions. So these have got to be Azure regions. And then we set the deployment environment to be, in this case, to be dev. I've got the -v for verbose, and I've set a unique deployment ID. Now the reason for this is some of the things in Azure, some of the artifacts we create in Azure, such as API management, have to have a globally unique identifier on them, so that when we generate the scripts, we just really append a unique deployment ID so that we can make sure that we're not getting name clashes with anyone else's deployments. And I've got the no abort flag, which means it'll keep running even if there's an error. So let me just copy that out, paste it into my command prompt, and bingo, there we go. So we are now running BizTalk Migrator. And you'll see there that we've got some folders appearing. And so there we go. So I ran this in verbose mode so that we've got an absolute ton of stuff going into the output stream, and so what we can see, so you can, if you want to actually pipe this to a file, you can see everything that tool's actually done. So it starts off, it loads a load of plugins, and then it, and then it's running the different stages, saving state. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but what we're left with on the hard drive is we've got a couple of folders, and the unpack folder is actually where our BizTalk MSI has been unpacked to. So if we look at that, there's our FTP pass-through, and I don't know if you know much about MSIs, but they are effectively, they're effectively a zip file with some cab files inside them. So this is the contents of a cab file. There's the BizTalk, here's the BizTalk binding. And in this one, we've got the application definition file. And again, for those of you familiar with BizTalk, you kind of know what an application definition file has got. It's got things like the application name. It's got, if you set one, an application description, and quite importantly, it's got the references so that you know which other BizTalk applications have been referenced. And obviously the binding file has got a description of all the BizTalk artifacts. So your module ref collection includes any orchestrations if you've got them, and then you've got the send ports, and you've also got receive ports. So that's all in there. So we've unpacked all that out of the folder, and what we've generated is in this folder is a so this after stage runner and before stage runner is our save state, which is actually the serialized model of everything we've created, and then the conversion folder is where all the artifacts to create your application are. But what I'm going to look at now is this one here, which is the BizTalk migration report. So if we open the BizTalk migration report, we get some summary run information. In particular, we can look at what arguments we've passed. So some of these arguments have defaulted, some of them are empty. And then we've also got what are called the stage runners. Now the stage runners are all the different plugins that have run. So we can look at those, and then we can see which ones, which components have been run. And then we look at we can then list the input BizTalk applications. So you can pass more than one MSI into the tool. You can pass a folder containing MSIs, and it will just look for all the MSIs in it. In this case, we've just run it against one, so we've got an input BizTalk application there. Then we've got the output applications. So there's the equivalent one that was being created. And then there's another two pieces in the report that have been created. So we've got a message bus. Now a message bus is actually, these are all the core things that any integration app or any messaging app is going to need, regardless of whether it's come from BizTalk or not. So for example, things like Azure Service Bus, API management, the core resources like that any converted application would need. They've been created in this message bus. And then we've got this system application at the bottom, which is effectively all the bits and pieces that we need to convert a BizTalk application. So that we can then we know that those things are there. We know we've got the core infrastructure in place so that we can just do the conversion. So if I just have a quick look at some of these, we've got the FTP pass-through, and so this bit of the report is showing everything that we've discovered on the BizTalk application. So we can, in terms of the BizTalk application, we've got two children of this really. We've got a receive port and a send port, because this is the most simple application. So the receive port is a one-way, and okay, it's got its parent and its child. Its child is the receive location. Receive location is an FTP. That's our, that's the address there. So at the moment it's looking for star.star on the mask. And then the send port is a static. It's an FTP. It's a one-way, and we've got a little macro in that there, so it's sending the message ID.xml, and because it's, well, assuming we're sending an XML, right? And then we've got a subscription. So we also have a subscription here. It's just noted that the send port has a subscription. The report hasn't actually listed what that is. And so when we look at what we've produced, the FTP pass-through part of the report, the output application. So it shows how many messages we've discovered. Well, this is just FTP, so it hasn't got any schemas. So we don't have any messages. The endpoints, so there's two endpoints. There's the receive part and the end part. And then so what this uses is it's built on a particular enterprise integration pattern called the routing slip router. So effectively a channel is a communication point between two components, and an intermediary is a component that does something. So we see how many channels, how many intermediaries. Then we've got scenarios as well. So for example, a receive port is a scenario because it's really an end-to-end thing that you take a message in at one end and you write to a message box at the other. So that is an end-to-end scenario. A send port is an end-to-end scenario. So you subscribe to a message at one end and you write through an adapter to the other. So but at the same time in BizTalk, an orchestration could be a scenario. So in this, it's just simple. So we've got two scenarios, and then we've got the number of resources we've generated, and actually 35. So quite a lot of files generated just to make this happen. But we can actually follow these scenarios through now. So given the fact that we've got our receive location, then that is an adapter. And we can have a bunch of, we've got a bunch of properties against that. So we know that ultimately we've got a trigger in the logic app doing this. And we've also got, see things like the a bunch of warnings, because there isn't always 100% fidelity between BizTalk and logic apps. We also list out the resources that have been generated. So, so we're creating, a logic app, creating a routing slip which tells the flow of control where to go, and various configuration and routing properties. And we then work through the port to sort of say, well, okay, here's the channel, so we've got communication. We've then got a routing slip router, which we see that quite a lot. That is telling us where the next step is. So we then go to a content promoter. So this is the equivalent of promoting your context properties in the BizTalk pipeline. We have another routing slip router telling us where to go next, and then we have the message publisher, which says to write to the message box. And then the last thing is the routing slip router says, have we got anywhere else to go? And we don't, so that's the end. The second scenario is the send port. So again, we have the adapter or the subscription for the send port. We then have a look at where we need to send that next, and we send it to the send port adapter. And again, we can look at the properties of that, and that's the FTP send. So I know this is a very quick lightning tour of the report, but as you can see, there's a whole ton of detail in the way that this BizTalk application has been broken down into really small granular components and then reassembled in a different set of components that can actually be described in Azure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Dan, and Dan is going to take us through the actual content that's being produced from this, and then talk us through deploying that into Azure, and then give that a whirl. So, Dan, do you want to share your one?
Yep, no problems at all. Right, can you hear me, everyone? I am going to share my VM here. Can you see that, Andrew?
Yep, I've got it. You're now live, Dan.
Excellent. Okay, Hi, everyone. So thanks for that, Andrew. Right, so where we've gone so far is obviously Andrew's taken us through the running the tool and looking through the report. So you'll notice I have a slightly different folder name here, but I've run the same scenario, the FTP pass-through scenario. And as Andrew showed you, we have all the report stuff. And in the conversion folder here, we have, from what we've discovered, at least anyway, all the ARM templates and scripts used to create everything. Now, the tool outputs two sort of do everything scripts, one that deploys everything and one that tears down everything. And you can run those, no problems at all, but I would expect most people who are using this tool to probably bring the ARM templates and scripts into their own CI/CD pipeline, whether that be Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions or something like that. If we go through the folders here, we'll probably cover this in another webinar later and go through this in greater detail. But in the message bus folder, we have common resources that are used by every application. If you've run this tool, one of the things you'll find is that when you run it multiple times and you're using the same deployment suffix, it'll reuse the common things, and you'll see that when I go and look at it in Azure. But effectively, in applications here, I've got my pass-through application, which was generated from the MSI, and then I've got a system application, which has common code that is BizTalk related. I think as Andrew talked about, you have this concept of a message bus, which is stuff that you'd expect to see in any general messaging system. And then in the system application, it's similar to the BizTalk system application. So it has some stuff in there that's specific to BizTalk. But if you go down to workflows, you'll find that there are various logic apps in there as well, and ditto under intermediaries here. So JSON encoder and decoder and a envelope wrapper and content demoter and promoter. If we go back to applications here, we've got the bits that made up our actual FTP application that we had in BizTalk. So under intermediaries, we've got a topic subscriber, which is subscribing to the message bus topic and then kicking off that pipeline. We've got endpoints in here, so we've got one for the FTP receive location and the FTP send port, and then various bits of configuration, and then there's a resource group that holds it all as well. In each of these, you find that the tools output a whole lot of scripts for you. So in this case here, the only bits, if you were working with, say, Azure DevOps, the only two bits you'd really need would be the actual ARM template and then the parameters. All the rest of this is to support that global deploy all and tear down script. It's quite useful actually, because it means that if you just want to deploy one thing from here, you can just run the deploy script that's here. So one of the things I can anticipate is that as the tool improves over time, well, I shouldn't say improves, as the tool has additional features added to it or bug fixes, if you find that there is an update to, say, a logic app or something like that you want to use, you can run the tool again, but then you could just run this individual deployment script for the particular item you want to redeploy. Ditto if you make changes to it. So if you go into the ARM template and make changes to, say, one of the logic apps or something like that. So when we run the deploy all script, it will deploy everything. And if it's the first time you've run this, it does take up to 45 minutes. You've noticed that on the Logic Apps Live late last week, Valerie had pre-recorded it and cut out some of it. And my understanding of the reason it takes so long is mainly APIM. APIM for a new install takes 35 to 40 minutes. So that will be the bulk of the time. If you've already got APIM installed, then the next time you run this, it's a lot quicker. And that means that if you, for example, with the example scenarios, if you run the FTP one, and that takes 45 minutes to do a full install, and then you run, say, the file one, and you run the deploy script, it only takes about 10 to 15 minutes because, being ARM and doing an incremental upgrade, it doesn't redeploy everything, it only deploys the changes, which is really important to know. So that deploys everything, and we end up in here. So if you can still see all this, we've got 3 resource groups created. Now, in my case, I've used a unique deployment suffix of BTS. You can use whatever you want, but that's used to make sure that the core items that are deployed don't conflict or have a namespace conflict with anyone else. So, for example, a storage account needs to be a globally unique name, but in our case here, if I go and find the storage account, which is in here, the storage account here, the storage, the ST for storage, AIM, message bus service, dev, 01, that is common, and then the BTS is what makes it unique. There's nothing to stop you going into the scripts and changing that name, but you'd have to change it all over the place as well. So we end up with these three resource groups, as I said, and we've got the message bus, which contains the core things that are used by every application that's deployed by the tool. So Key Vault, and there's some functions in there, and Azure App Configuration and APIM as well. One of the things we'll cover in a later stage is what happens if you want to reuse your existing APIM or app config, and there are ways of doing that we've discovered, at least anyway. The system application, as I mentioned earlier, is mainly BizTalk related things. So it's what you'd expect to find BizTalk providing for you. So we have there's a flat file message processor and content demoter and promoter and message response handlers and things like that, plus the service bus namespace. And in there, the tool has created a single topic, or a couple of topics, I should say. It's got a message box, a response topic, and a suspend queue topic. But the message bus topic replicates the BizTalk message bus, and therefore will have some subscriptions on it. This is taking longer than I would like, so I might skip it and come back. I don't know why that's taking quite so long. All right, I'll skip that. But in here anyway, there are some subscriptions that link together the receive port and send port. Right, if we come back out again, then at the top level here, we have a resource group that represents the application. So the MSI contained a single BizTalk application, and that has been outputted into its own resource group. So it has the name of the MSI is here, FTP pass-through. What was actually aim.ftp pass-through, so that's what's come across here. So you can always find your BizTalk applications that way. And if you go into it, one of the things we notice is that there are tags. So there's a tag here with the BizTalk application name, so aim-ftp pass-through. So the dot in its name has been replaced with a dash. And it's got what environment you deploy to as well. So inside here, we've got an FTP receive port, an FTP send port. We've got two API connections. Sorry, what am I looking at here? Here's the FTP receive port. Here's the FTP send port. Then we've got some API connections here for subscribing to FTP. And then we've got a topic subscriber, which is made part of this application as well. So if you think about it from a BizTalk point of view, you've got a send port and you have subscribed to a message, which then is handled by that send port. In this application, they're split into two separate things because you've got a pipeline in between them. You're subscribing to the message here, and then you're processing it through a pipeline, then you're finally sending it through the send port. First time you run the tool, you'll probably find that unless you've gone and edited the ARM parameter files, the ARM template parameter files, that these characters will be incorrect. The values in here will be incorrect, and you'll get an error in here saying that they could not connect. So what you have to do is come down to edit the API connection and fill it in with your own details. So you'll need an FTP server somewhere. It's actually easier in some ways to use the FTP scenario to start with. If you use the file scenario, which we'll cover in another webinar, you have to set up the on-premise data gateway, because as it stands today, if you're using the file system connector in AIS, that only works with the on-premise data gateway. So you've got to set that all up and everything like that. But we'll cover that in another webinar if Microsoft don't do that first. Right. So we've got all this here. Now, I'm sorry to say that so far I have not managed to get this working. I was furiously trying to get this working just before. I'm having a problem with my FTP server in that it's not reading files from it, but at least we can see what's going on. So if I come back here, we can see it's evaluated, but it's not actually running. If I come down here, it's skipping it each time. I'm not quite sure why. It's not finding the file I've put in. What we could do though is have a quick look at the Logic app and how it runs. So what we have going on inside here is, give that a second to pop up. So it's using the file, the FTP connector in Logic apps. I was just playing around with this to try and see if it was working by coming out here and seeing that I can click over here and it will find all the folders I have in my FTP server. So that is working. But originally that was reading from a parameter. And we've got how often we're checking for items, blah, blah, blah. One of the things that I've noticed the tool does is someone raised a question on the Logic Apps Live about how you do file masks. And I noticed that the way the tool's doing it is it's actually executing a bit of JavaScript to check that. So as you might be aware that the FTP connector and the file system connector don't support Windows style file masks. This is something important to understand, that that BizTalk uses a Windows style file mask. It's not a regex, it's Windows specific. So what's happening in here is that it is running a bit of regex to modify, to convert that file mask. It actually does that up here. It generates a regex mask from the file mask. Yeah. So and then it's just checking to make sure if the file it's found matches the mask. So one of the interesting things about the file system and FTP connectors and Logic apps is that you can run them in two ways. You can say, if a new file is dropped in, then get the file and its metadata, or you can say just get the metadata. So I don't want the file yet, I just want to know the details on the file, and that's what they're doing here. So they're checking the file name to see if it matches the mask, and if it does, then we're processing the file. If it doesn't, then we just stop. And that way we haven't actually retrieved the file from the FTP server. Similarly, BizTalk has an option that says delete the file after you've retrieved it. That's not supported with the FTP connector, but I imagine that would be fairly simple for Microsoft to add into the tool here, just with another step to say, do you want to delete the file once we've successfully processed it? I think that's all I can talk about, Andrew. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Excellent. I really wanted to show this going, but I can't quite. For some reason, it's not picking up, and I'm not quite sure why. It's not a problem with what it's put in here. It's a problem with my FTP server. For some reason, the permissions seem to have changed on it, and it's just not picking up that there's any files there at all. I can see it connecting in the logs, but it's not getting my file. So I'm going to keep working with that, but we might have to show that on the next webinar, unfortunately. Which is a shame. Or what we might do is, once I get this going, like we've done once before, when we upload this webinar, I'll probably have got that going, and we'll just tack this on to the end, showing it actually working, because it's a really good demo that you can see. You drop a file in, the file pops out the other end. But what's interesting is how we debug the files, how we debug the Logic apps, and see the thing running through, and that'll be the content for another webinar anyway. Alrighty.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so on the subject of things not quite working on webinars, we've noticed our live Q&A doesn't seem to be working in Teams as well at the moment. So unfortunately, we don't have live Q&A. However, what we will do is we're going to hang around here, and if you want to email in your questions, email them to my email, andrew@345.technology. And we'll do our best to go through them. So let's just leave a couple of moments for some questions to come in, and really looking forward to hearing some of your questions. In the meantime, one of the things that you mentioned on that one, Dan, was about how you can reuse your own existing API management. So, could you just sort of fill in a little bit about why you might want to do that and how you might do that?
Yeah, of course. So API management is a fairly expensive resource. So generally, you wouldn't, if you're working in a development environment, you wouldn't have multiple installs of API management because you're paying for each one. You might in a production sense if you are wanting to partition the data in some way, or you have different security policies for each, but it's more likely you just have one. So especially when people are trialing the tool, they probably already have API management, and there's no free edition of API management. The tool itself generally creates free versions of resources where necessary. So the SKU it uses, it creates a free one. And my understanding is that so that when you deploy the tool, you're not immediately hit with a big bill. Someone get a surprise at the end of the month for how much your subscription billing is. But API management doesn't have a free version, so the development version is installed. But if you already have API management, you probably don't want to install the new one. And it is possible to get the tool to reuse an existing API management, but it's a little bit trickier than, say, reusing the Azure app configuration or the integration account. Those two are relatively simple. But API management, because it's linked to in so many different places and you have a subscription key, it's generally easier to modify the ARM templates that are output by the tool to reflect the fact that you're using a new API management instance. But it's definitely possible to do it. It's just at the moment, it's not a simple task. You've got to change things in quite a few places. My rationale behind it at the moment is I let the tool install a new version of API management and just use that. But yeah, I think if you've got an existing subscription and you want to reuse it, that's something that I think good feedback from Microsoft might be, can they clarify exactly how to reuse an existing API management?
Cool. Thanks for that, Dan. So we do actually have a first question in. Thanks for that. So that is, why we use an app config? So where does in the whole picture of converting BizTalk to AIS, where does app config fit in the design of the target solution?
That's a really good question, and I think again, this is my understanding of it, but app config sits in for SSO. So app config is relatively new. Azure app config app configuration is relatively new. I think it's out of preview. I'm not sure. But it's a configuration store for any type of data across your subscription. So before app config, you had choices. Where do you store your configuration? Do you use a database? Do you use a storage queue? Not storage queue, sorry, a file queue or something like that. Azure file storage, or do you use the Azure table storage as well, or do you use Azure SQL or something else? At least with app config, you get it's only designed for configuration. You can put in multiple versions. So similar to Key Vault, you can put in a value and specify what version of that you want, or at least you will be able to. And you can have tags as well. So you can basically create one lookup key and say, here's like a dev version or a prod version or something like that. The other big thing is it's got built-in connections to Key Vault. So you can have it so that when you go to retrieve something from app config, the value isn't stored in app config, it's stored in Key Vault. So as far as I understand, this is an equivalent of single sign-on in BizTalk. So BizTalk stores all its configuration, like your port configurations for your send port and everything else like that, in single sign-on, and this is the equivalent of doing it. And it gives you there's no caching built in, but there's supposed to be. And from looking through the code, I can see that what the tool does is it's got an APIM front end that caches the values it retrieves from app config. But yes, app config is the equivalent of SSO.
Cool, nice one. So we've got another one that's come in, which is again another really good question that we could see in the message bus. There was a routing slip router. So yes. Where does that fit in the overall picture? What is the routing slip router doing, and how is it used?
That's a really good question. Okay, so
because I kind of touched on it very, very briefly, that it's all down to the underlying design pattern that's being used.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, how does that fit in the message box and how is that used by the app?
So the interesting thing about routing slip router is BizTalk doesn't really, so BizTalk hides a lot from you. It implements enterprise patterns, but you don't, as a BizTalk developer, you don't necessarily know that it's doing that. And it does kind of implement a routing slip router in that, you know, if you set up a receive port and a receive location, you're saying that I'm using this protocol, like FTP, to pick up a file, and then I'm running it through this pipeline, and then I am publishing it to the message box, and then it's going somewhere else. Now, that is an inherent routing slip. The fact BizTalk doesn't necessarily call it that is a different matter, but the routing slip is saying, where do I go to next? When you create a custom pipeline or you use one of the built-in pipelines in, say, a receive location, you might be running through a number of different steps there. And that is technically a routing slip. It's just not implemented using the pattern we would understand. But the AIS output that we have here makes it concrete by implementing an actual routing slip. And the benefit of that is that you can change the routing slip. So you can change where things go. So you get the ability to actually modify through configuration the path that a message is going to take. It's a little bit like the ESB toolkit in BizTalk that uses itineraries. So an itinerary is quite similar to a routing slip. It's a different pattern, but conceptually the idea is the same, which is that I want to state where everything is going. So up front, I want to know where my message is going, what different intermediaries, you know, what different modules or pipeline components in BizTalk, you know, terminology, a message is going to pass through. And routing slip router controls all that by saying, let's look up the routing slip and decide where we're going next, and then execute each of the steps. Hoping that might have clarified things a bit.
Certainly did for me.
Perhaps not for others.
Perhaps not for others. So we got another question here through from Andy. Thanks, Andy. So obviously I showed the ADF file and how we enumerated referenced applications. So so the question here is, how does the tool chase down those references and convert them, or is it really just converting the top of the reference stack? And so let me just so I think I can certainly make a start on this one, Dan, but do chip in if I miss anything or say anything totally wrong. So with a reference application, one of the things I mentioned was that you can pass through a number of MSIs into the BizTalk Migrator. So what you'd ideally do is that if you had a number of applications that were referencing each other, or one was referencing the other, you'd pass them all in. So because it can unpack, you know, we can process more than one MSI at a time, and you build up, and in the object model, it builds up application by application, and so when you've got a dependency, it will actually look in the reference application to see if that dependency is there. So I think that's if that's so, it will still actually create more than one application in the target. So if you've got BizTalk application A references BizTalk application B, you'll still get AIS application A referencing AIS application B. It will generate both of them, but when it's doing the conversion, it will actually do the dependency check to make sure that all the dependencies are actually there, and you get. And I think if you've got missing dependencies, so for example, if a map is expecting a schema and that schema doesn't exist, then you'll get a warning and the conversion will fail. So
yes, that's
is there anything else you want to add to that?
To continue. Well, I was going to say there's an option to tell it to continue as well. I think the no abort, because you might. So when we were testing with some of our client MSIs, we found that we had a collection of MSIs, but we were missing a core one. But the core one wasn't actually necessary, so we were able to run the tool. I think it's -- no abort, no - abort, which means it will keep running even if it's missing things. So it will actually generate all the output as much as it can which is useful. So I guess you've got a choice then, but yes, you're quite right. It walks the dependency tree to check to see what's there, and if something's missing, it's going to say, hey, I can't continue because I'm missing this schema. But you can run the tool with that flag to indicate that you actually want to continue.
Cool. Nice.
Breaking news, Andrew. Breaking news.
Oh.
I've just got my little demo working. I'm hoping I can just very quickly switch over now.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to share your screen again?
Yeah. Give me a second, and I will come back to here. Right. Let me know when you can see that.
Yep.
Alrighty. So it's going to be the world's most boring demo, but I have a test file here, and I'm going to drag it over and drop it into the inbound folder. And
well, this is basically like every BizTalk sales demo ever, though, isn't it?
Exactly right. Yes. I've had to rename it and change the date in it because if you've worked with the FTP connector, is that it maintains an internal list of what it's processed, which is why it doesn't need to delete each file as it's processed it. It won't touch that file again. But there are settings on the connector to say, do you want to touch the file if it's, if the date changes or whatever. But if I come here to the output, and where's it gone? Oh no, it did work. It was there. I deleted the file as output. Hold on. Let's try again. Oh, I should have left the file that was there so you could see it worked. If I come back to the tool here, you can see it actually ran here. Oh, do you know what it is? I bet you I've got two versions of the tool running. If I come over here. No, I don't. Okay. Right. Well, it actually did run first time round and picked up the file, but it looks like it hasn't picked up that second file for some reason. I don't understand why. But it's picked up that file, and we can see in here that in the run history here, we can see that we go down here and we've got green, 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 and it's successfully got the file content. So if I come into here and look at this, I can see this is some text, and that was the content of my file, and it's run all the way through. And then if I look in the send port here, this logic app, you can see it successfully wrote out a file as well, which is brilliant. It's just that I don't know what happened to that file.
So
I deleted it so that I could do this again.
While you're on this, we've got another question in, which is there seems to be a lot of moving parts in this. Does the performance stack up against BizTalk?
That's a really good question. We are in ongoing conversation with Microsoft about this because I don't know if you're a Logic Apps developer, you know that Logic Apps has been getting better with performance, but if you want to do incredibly low latency type transactions with it, sub-second, the existing runtime is well, you'd have a challenge with that because even a simple HTTP request response takes a couple of seconds generally. Although it's got a lot better recently, it's sub-second now. But if you're doing things like pulling up API,
but it is generally because in Azure, obviously things are everything's wired together via API calls across various bits and bobs in the data center, including to your storage and that sort of thing. So that it's the very things that allow it to scale out and be resilient and all that sort of thing also mean there's a lot of chatty API stuff happening underneath. So yeah, there is a performance hit. I haven't got anything quantifiable, but certainly it is slower. But the point, I suppose, one of the other points is though that your performance doesn't change with throughput.
No, that's exactly right. As you scale, it doesn't change at all. People talk about BizTalk and say, if I create an FTP scenario and I drop a file and it comes out the other end, that might take 2 or 3 seconds, 5 seconds for it to appear, depending on if it's the first time you started it up. We're seeing performance here. On this one here, it took about 27 seconds, but then I'm using the default polling. So this is another issue here, is that Logic Apps uses polling triggers generally. So the file system and the FTP connectors are polling-based triggers, as are the service bus ones. So you could set the polling quicker With BizTalk, you don't have this issue. BizTalk, there is a polling interval, but the more polls you do in logic apps, the more you're going to pay, because you're paying for each. You get charged per action. Yeah, exactly right. So there's a whole lot of different factors here. One of the things I do know is that the new logic apps runtime on functions has this concept of stateless logic apps, which are designed for sub-second performance, low latency scenarios. And so I'm expecting the performance to get a lot better. But as you referred to, in BizTalk, if I do one file, it might take 3 seconds. On here, it might take 27 seconds. But then if I do 10,000 files in BizTalk, you know, you've got a single BizTalk server, watch what happens. Whereas on here, it will still take 27 seconds. This scales much better than BizTalk will. However, if performance is a big issue, if you need it to be, I put a file in, I need that file back out again within 1 or 2 seconds. I don't think this is quite there yet. There is tweaking you can do, and I think we could probably have a separate webinar on performance, because I've got the performance down by tweaking the code here. I've got, you know, quite good performance, and you know, I know what you need to do. So yes, but it is a sticking point today that the performance could be better, especially with some of the request response scenarios.
And I think one of the other things to add to that is that if we look at the way that we've got things like the root and slip router pattern that allows you to break the application up into reusable pieces. Yeah. And that's really good, because then you've got, because you have a number of components and you've only got one instance of them, and then if you need to fix that one component, you fix it in one place, all that sort of stuff. It is entirely possible to take those bits of logic app and compress them all down into a bigger logic app, and that will potentially make it faster. But the trade-off is things like maintainability and all that sort of thing. So again, there's so many things to say about this, but one of them is that your converted app, when we've converted the app and it goes into the output folder, that's almost like that's the starting point of your development process. That can go into your DevOps process, but you can then take that as the starting point for building your app. It doesn't necessarily need to be the finish point. It can be, you can always then refine that and just take that as a starting point and just tweak and refine it from there. So I think that's also an important thing to bear in mind, is that because it generates the logic app source code, you don't have to, that's not your finishing point. You can do whatever you want with it. Then it just gives you a fast route to get something that works.
That's exactly right, Andrew. That's very, very true. That you could, from what I understand, I quite like the way you can configure this. And one of the things we'll show in a demo later is that you can modify the pipeline. So like in BizTalk, if I want to change the pipeline for a receive location to suddenly be a custom one with a flat file decoder in it, I can do that in this solution, in the AI solution, by just changing configuration item. There's no development required. If I pulled all that into one logic app, I'd have to go and edit the logic app. But I guess it swings and roundabouts. It depends what's important to you. What's the minimum performance you want. But my gut feel is that the performance of this will get better. That this is an initial, let's keep the configuration and make sure that what's been output matches what was in BizTalk as much as possible, and then start tweaking the performance. At least my discussions with Microsoft have indicated that to be the case. One thing I'll quickly say is, here's the file. We were talking about performance. I'd forgotten that the FTP send port is running on a 60-second polling cycle. So I was expecting it to appear immediately, or after 20 seconds, but it appeared a minute, 27 seconds later. So you can see here's the file, output file, and it's got a GUID.xml, even though I dropped in, test file 1.txt. And the reason for that, if we come back and look at the send logic app, is that it has some settings in here under the code view. We can see the file send name. So what was the output file name that was requested? I seem to be having issues with the portal today, but when this eventually loads up, what you'll see at the bottom, here we go, down under the parameters, is that the output file name is a BizTalk macro. So it's the default macro you get with the send port in BizTalk, which is percentage message ID percentage.xml. So the unique ID for that message.
That's what was in the send port. Yeah, that's what was in the send port.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are pretty close time-wise to the end of the webinar. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put up the slide showing the next webinar, 2 weeks time. Please make sure you register for that one. But rapid fire a couple of questions, Dan. What about tags? How there were tags in the deployed solution. What's the thinking around how they're used?
My understanding again is you can group logic apps together. So like in BizTalk, if you want to stop or start an application, it stops or starts everything involved with it. Tags allow you to do something very similar. You can write a script that says, please stop or disable all resources that share this tag. So it means that you could write a script to say, please stop this application. Yeah, that's the way I can see tags being used.
Okay. Why do we use integration accounts? Aren't they really, really expensive?
It's a really good question. That's one to take up with Microsoft. Today, at least in the current, well, I shouldn't call it V1 logic apps, but today you need integration accounts if you want to do any of the XML actions like XML transform, schema validation, flat file encode and decode all require an integration account. And the rationale behind that is all of those use BizTalk code, and BizTalk is not a free product. So you're using the logic apps team, at least my understanding, they've taken the actual BizTalk code and built it into an integration account, and therefore there's a charge for using it because it's regarded as sort of an enterprise feature. I do know that things like the use of inline code, so today it only supports JavaScript, but that will no longer require an integration account on the new version of logic apps. I don't think it's there yet, so I imagine that will disappear. It's a tricky thing. I guess you'd have to, if you don't want to use an integration account, then you have to ask Microsoft to make XML transforms, XML validation, flat file decode free, effectively. Or you write your own code to do it. Write your own flat file decoder, and then you won't need an integration account. But that's quite a tricky thing to do. There's a lot in it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, in a nutshell.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up there for today. So thanks everyone. Some absolutely fantastic questions that we've had throughout that. And Dan, again, just thanks again for sharing your immense knowledge on all things related to Azure and Logic Apps, and especially for a late breaking fix on FTP, which is which is really good. So
sweaty brow.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, we're going to wrap up there. We're just about gone over the hour. Thanks a lot. Next time we're going to go into more scenarios. So I showed you those scenarios that ship with the tool. So we're going to look at some of those other ones and how those actually manifest themselves as logic apps, and just go into a bit, just another layer of delving down into what's output from the BizTalk Migrator. So from that, thanks a lot, and we will catch you next time. So bye now.
Good work. Cheers. Thank you.